Some of the most overlooked pieces of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament is internal evidence. In contrast to external evidence, which looks at how well the New Testament conforms with outside facts, these arguments look at clues within the New Testament that speak to its reliability. In other words, if the New Testament is reliable and trustworthy, then it should contain a large amount of internal clues that confirm this. We've already looked at two sections of internal evidence. In Part 3, we looked at how the New Testament preserves a controlled oral tradition that is unlikely to have been fabricated. And in Part 4, we looked at the internal evidence, which suggests an early dating for many of the New Testament books, and puts them very close to the ministry of Jesus. So in this video, we'll look at three other pieces of internal evidence, such as excessive non-theological verbiage, the criteria of embarrassment, and undesigned coincidences. So diving right in, we'll start with the first one, of excessive non-theological verbiage. This piece of evidence speaks to the unlikeliness the New Testament was made up as later myths, or was later intentionally corrupted by scribes. For example, throughout Paul's epistles, there are verses which have no theological or spiritual significance, such as Paul mentioning he will be visiting the Corinthian church, but he'll stay in Ephesus for a time, or that Paul wastes time to instruct Timothy to bring him his cloak and his books. In the Gospels as well, there are entire passages with no theological teaching, such as a group of women named in Luke 8 that followed Jesus, or mentioning that Simon was father of Alexander and Rufus. These passages would have been unlikely to have been made up at a later date if you're just making up stories and theological teachings, because they would only matter to specific people very early on and carry no lasting theological significance for later generations. Yet the epistles are filled with verses like this. What would the reasons be for including these verses if the New Testament was made up by later generations to teach theology through myth? Including them was an unnecessary waste of your precious space, unless of course the New Testament is not a myth, and Paul was actually writing to the Corinthian church, and these unnecessary verses were included because they mattered to the people Paul was writing directly to. Second, the fact that verses like these are included speak to the integrity of later scribes. If a scribe was only concerned with preserving the sections of scripture that mattered, we would expect passages like these to have been removed. Now some may object that it would not have been too hard to simply copy these sections as well, but we need to remember to not read scripture with a modern lens. Papyrus in ink 2,000 years ago was not cheap like it is today. To copy and preserve a document was an expensive endeavor. Papyrus the size of Mark's Gospel or 1 Corinthians alone cost roughly 2 denarii, and a day's wage was 1 denarii. So to obtain the money for just one papyrus, you would need to work at least 2 full days, and possibly more. Something for the size of Luke or Mark would cost about 5 denarii. Then that doesn't even include ink and the time it takes to write. If you don't know how to write, you would need to hire a scribe on top of that. So this was not an easy process like it is today. This was a full-blown project that would cost a lot of money and time. Yet despite this, copyists kept this unnecessary excessive language that does not apply to their generation, when it would have been easier, cheaper, and less time-consuming to simply cut out these parts. Plus, considering the amount of room a papyrus has, the unnecessary passages could have been removed and replaced with more important doctrines scribes thought should have been in the originals. This would have been the perfect place to add and make up possible sayings of Jesus to deal with later issues the church struggled with, like if Christians needed to be circumcised, or what was the place of speaking in tongues, or when to celebrate Easter. But instead of doing this for their convenience and ease, we find this unnecessary language that would only have mattered to the original readers. And these later issues the church struggled with were not resolved by making up Jesus' sayings, when it would have been the easiest thing to do. This shows Christian scribes were more concerned with preserving these documents at their own expense and effort than only preserving what was theologically important to them and using the extra space to insert convenient lies.